Hi, my name's Steve Cordell. I'm the host of the Let Us Study Together channel on YouTube. It's normally a channel that I use for Bible study and proclaiming the gospel, but I'm making this video for a different purpose. So why would a gospel preacher be making a video that's got nothing to do with the Bible? I'm glad you asked. I know that guy from somewhere. But what's the big deal about the 2026 midterms? And normally I try to keep politics off the channel, but this is going to be more of a history talk. And I'm doing it to answer a question from a friend of mine, and we're actually friends in real life, believe it or not. Yeah, I do have friends. But we are friends in real life and have been for years, and Julie lives in the United Kingdom. And she posted this on her Facebook page asking, can I ask my American friends, what is the significance of midterms? Is it just to see what the population is thinking, or does it have effect on actual government? And I pondered her question and started to write out an answer, and then I got to thinking about it. There are a lot of Americans who don't understand the political process, and a lot of Americans who might be asking the very same question. So I thought I'd make this video and see if I could help muddy the waters a little more. In answer to her first question, is it just to see what the population is thinking? The answer to that is, yeah, kind of, sort of, in a way. Because the midterms are many times seen as a referendum on the party in power, which in America is defined as the party that occupies the White House. Donald Trump being a Republican, the Republicans are considered the party in power, even if they don't have either house of Congress. And typically it is seen as a referendum on his job performance to that point, but I don't think it's necessarily the best barometer or best measuring rod, and I'll explain why in just a minute. The second part of her question, or the second question, does it have effect on actual government? And the answer to that is undoubtedly yes. It does have an effect on government, and we'll explain why as we go along. So now, why would a preacher be making this kind of a video? Well, my bachelor's is actually in criminal justice, and my minor is in history. I emphasize U.S. history, but I did a lot of European history as well. And then I taught history, American history, at Lamar Community College in Lamar, Colorado. And I was a paraprofessional at Somerset Academy, working with teachers and teaching and helping teach, among other things, U.S. history. Now, as far as the American government is concerned, some preliminaries need to be established first. And this is not well understood by people outside the United States, and I really don't think it's very well understood by Americans many times. We've got three branches of government. Theoretically, they are co-equal. And Article 1 of our Constitution says that all the legislative powers are vested in the Congress, broken into two houses, the House of Representatives, which is actually modeled on the House of Commons over in England, and the Senate, which is modeled on the House of Lords. The Senate is considered the upper chamber. You typically have congressmen who will run for a Senate seat. You rarely see a senator go the other way, go back to the House of Representatives. To a lot of cases, that's considered basically a step down. But there are, I think, a few senators who've been in the House of Representatives. I just can't think of any off the top of my head. And then once they pass the legislation, it goes to the executive branch. And then the president, the executive branch, is charged with enforcing the laws, carrying out the laws passed by the legislature, and that's Article 2 of our Constitution. And then we go to the judiciary, which is established by Article 3, which in a nutshell says the judicial powers of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in inferior courts which Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Article 3 of the three articles, Article 3 is actually the shortest, and yet many times it seems it's the courts are the more powerful of the three branches. And the power to declare laws unconstitutional, that we call that judicial review, it's actually not even mentioned in the Constitution. It was more, I would say, assumed by the Supreme Court in a case called Marbury versus Madison that came out about 1801 or 1802. And all the arguments there and the facts there, that's another discussion for another time. But if we start with Congress and the elections that happen there, a new Congress begins at noon on January 3rd of each odd-numbered year following a general election, and unless it's designated to a different time by Congress. or rather by law, I should say. I think there would have to be some constitutional amendments to actually change that. But Congress lasts for 2 years, and each year is a separate session. So as of noon on January the 3rd, 2025, the 119th Congress is in session until 11:59 a.m. Eastern Time or Washington time on January 3rd, 2027. And on January 3rd, 2026, the second session of the 119th Congress will commence. Now, in the House of Representatives, we've got right now, we have 220 Republicans, 213 Democrats, and there are currently 2 vacancies. And that's 435 seats total. Now, the thing about the House of Representatives, because it is the larger of the 2 bodies, you could do a 20 or 30-year career and nobody know who you are outside of your district, unless you get elected, say, party leader or chairman of one of the important committees like appropriations or armed services or something like that. At any given time, there may be a vacancy or 2 in the House of Representatives, and constitutionally, it's up to the legislature to determine how to fill those vacancies. Typically, what happens is there will be a special election called in that district, and whichever party had the seat prior to the vacancy will usually retain it. Typically, the seat is vacant because the holder of the seat has died. That's probably the number one reason. Sometimes the president may appoint that person to the cabinet or to an ambassadorship or some other post, and they have to resign their seat in Congress. And again, there'll be a special election to fill it. Or it could be that person maybe wins a special election to another office. They may resign to run for another office. They may run for governor of their state or decide to make a run for the Senate or something and decide to vacate their seat so they can run on that campaign. Typically, if it's, say, in the case of the death of the congressman, a lot of times it's their spouse who gets elected to fill the seat. It could be their chief of staff. Both parties have got lists of candidates in these seats and for these elections that they can call on to run if there's a vacancy, and typically whichever party has the seat will retain it because of 435 seats, I think about 300, and I may be a little off on this, but somewhere probably I'm going to guess about 375 to 400 of those seats are safe for one party or the other, and the chances of flipping them are pretty slim. Currently, I reside in the state of Illinois. Illinois right now has 17 congressional districts. We lost one after the 2020 census because Illinois' population has been steadily declining since the 1970s. Went from about 12.8 million in the 2010 census to about 12.5 million. It's about a 2% drop. And down here in the lower left corner of this map, this is Metro Chicago. Chicago, 9 of our 14 districts somehow touch the Chicago area. And that's a very Democrat stronghold, and that's why Illinois is pretty much owned lock, stock, and barrel by the Democrat Party. There are 2 Republicans in the delegation. The others are Democrats. Now, as of January 2026, I'll be relocated to the volunteer state, Tennessee. Tennessee has 9 congressional seats, and that is unchanged from the 2010 census. Their population did increase, but apparently not enough to gain another seat in Congress. Now, Tennessee is the exact opposite of Illinois. Of the 9 congressional seats Tennessee has, 7 are Republican and 2 are Democrat. I believe that's the 6th and the 9th districts are Democrat, I think. Over here in West Tennessee, around Memphis, and then up here in Middle Tennessee around Nashville. I think those are Democrat, not positive about that. So don't hold me to that. So let's talk a little bit about the House of Representatives. 435 seats. Now, a member of the House is also sometimes addressed as a congressman. Gets a little confusing since both bodies as a collective are called Congress, but only in the House of Representatives would they be called a congressman. 435 seats in the House of Representatives are apportioned by population. And it's set at 435 based on the Apportionment Act of 1929. Now, there are some that think we should increase that because at 1929, our population was around 130 million, something like that. And now with over 300 million people and still only 435 representatives, that's quite a ratio you've got going there. So some have thought we should increase it, and that's another discussion we can have another time. Every 2 years, the entire House stands for election. And so theoretically, we could have a new House every 2 years. It's never happened, and quite frankly, I don't see it happening. But hey, you never know. Each state has at least one representative. Again, they're based on population. And remember, not geography, but population. Sometimes when you look at a congressional map, you'll see some really weird shapes with congressional delegations. In one case, years ago in North Carolina, there was a district, and I forget which one, and they've added seats, I think, since then. But there was one district that went east to west, and part of it was the interstate highway that connected the two parts of it. You got off the interstate, you were in a completely different congressional district. California has the most representatives, 52. They actually lost one in 2020 because their population started to decline. But since statehood, California gained at least one seat every census up until, I believe it was 2010, when they leveled out, and now they've lost a seat. And then every 10 years, we conduct a census. This is constitutionally mandated, that we conduct a census every 10 years, and the primary purpose was to apportion the House of Representatives. Our founders were smart enough and wise enough to realize that populations shift, and we were already beginning a westward expansion, so they saw the need to occasionally reapportion the House. So we have that 10-year census. And the House of Representatives has got certain powers that the other branches of government don't have. For instance, all revenue bills must start in the House of Representatives and then go over to the Senate. So anything to do with spending money, raising money, it's got to start in the House. And then they also have the authority to impeach civil officials. Now, impeachment is not widely understood by Americans, let alone anybody from outside the country. Impeachment of a civil official simply means he has been formally charged with an offense. Constitutionally, they can be charged with high crimes, misdemeanors, and treason, and bribery. Those are the named ones. Now, it gets a little murky with the whole high crimes thing that came up with Bill Clinton's impeachment. I believe most legal scholars would say that anything that's a felony would be considered a high crime, but who knows? And then so the impeachment for us regular working stiffs outside of Congress, that would be the equivalent to a grand jury indictment. The grand jury, and not all jurisdictions use the grand jury, but they typically, first of all, meet in secret, and then they issue a true bill, which means that somebody has been indicted and formally charged with a crime. In that case, it would be a felony. And then once the indictment's handed down, an arrest warrant would be issued, and the person would then come into court, be advised of the charges. How do you plead? Well, I plead guilty. Okay, we'll hand you over for sentencing. Or I plead not guilty. Okay, we'll set you over for trial. And then it would be the trial jury or the petty jury that decides guilt or innocence. And if nobody gets a majority in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives gets to elect the president. And this is where it can get interesting, because it's not one vote per congressman, it's one vote per delegation. So, if, let's say, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris ended in a tie, the Illinois delegation would have to huddle up on January the 6th, and they would have to decide how they're going to vote. Now, with a 15-2 Democrat to Republican, how do you think that vote's going to go? Now, whereas in, say, Texas, which is dominated by the Republicans, or we'll use Tennessee since I know the count there, Tennessee with 7 Republicans and 2 Democrats, how do you think that count's going to go? Yeah. And when this came about with the whole Bush-Gore fiasco, it was mentioned there that it would be possible for one party to have a majority, but not have enough electoral votes, because the Democrats may have a majority, but you may have individual delegations, enough individual delegations that have a majority Republicans, hence they could put the Republican candidate over the top. Sound confusing? Yeah, I thought so. This is Representative Mike Johnson, a Republican from the Louisiana 4th Congressional District. Elected to Congress in 2016, he took office in January 3rd, 2017, and then in October of 2023, he was elected Speaker of the House. Now, I put him up here for a specific reason. The Speaker, obviously, is the presiding officer of the House of Representatives, and he is elected from the majority party. And if, let's say that Donald Trump doesn't wake up when he goes to bed, and then upon hearing the news that he is now president, J.D. Vance has a fatal heart attack. Mike Johnson then becomes president. The Speaker of the House stands behind the vice president in the line of presidential succession, and a lot of people don't know that. So I just thought I'd put that out there. Now let's go over to the other chamber. Let's go to the Senate. There are currently 53 Republicans in the Senate, 45 Democrats, and 2 independents that caucus with the Democrats, for a total of 100. And in the United States Senate, there are currently 100 senators, and each of the 50 states gets 2 senators regardless of population. Senators are elected to a 6-year term. That's part of the reason it's considered the upper house of the two. And then every even-numbered years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election, or just up for election, I guess, if a seat is being vacated. And then in that third election cycle, you'll have 34 seats to make the total of 100. But in mathematical round figures, 1/3 of the Senate every year is up for, or every 2 years rather, is up for re-election. There are 2 independents in the Senate who caucus with the Democrats. Senator Bernard Sanders of Vermont, who is self-identified as a socialist, and then Senator Angus King of Maine, who served as Maine's 72nd governor. And prior to 1993, he was a Democrat. Now, the Senate, like the House, has special powers that no other branch has. First of all, they get to confirm certain presidential appointments, including ambassadors and cabinet secretaries. And the Senate also approves the appointment of federal judges. And this is arguably the number one reason that people keep a close eye on Senate races. Judicial appointments are for life. And when someone gets appointed to the federal bench, whether it be to the district court, which is a court of general trial jurisdiction in the federal court system, or the appeals court, or the U.S. Supreme Court, the grand prize, those are lifetime appointments. They could be there for 20, in some cases up to maybe 40 or 50 years, depending on how old they are when they're appointed. So this is a big deal to a lot of people as to who gets appointed to the benches, to the various federal benches. The Senate also gets to approve treaties. It takes a 2/3 majority to approve the U.S. entry into a treaty. Now, they kind of get around this sometimes by giving it different names like, I don't know, North American Free Trade Agreement instead of treaty. It really was a treaty. And it took both houses of Congress to vote in favor of it. So, yeah, they'll play with that one a little bit. And then once impeached or charged by the House of Representatives, the Senate holds the actual trial of government officials once they've been impeached or they've indicted, however you want to look at it. Once they have the trial, they decide to remove the accused. If the accused is convicted, they are removed from office. And to remove a president from office, it takes a 2/3 vote of the senators. Currently, you'd need 67 votes to remove him. The closest that's ever come was in 1868, when Andrew Johnson became the first president to be impeached. That was kind of a weird situation. Abraham Lincoln was reelected in 1864. He took Johnson as his running mate. Andrew Johnson was a Southern Democrat, but Lincoln put him on his national unity ticket. Johnson was the only Southern senator to remain loyal to the Union, and as a reward, he was made military governor of his home state, Tennessee. And so when Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson becomes president, and there was at the time no vice president appointed. That's another discussion for another time. And the so-called radical Republicans in Congress went after Johnson. He did not get along with the congressional leaders, and his, I would say, arguably impeachment was really more political than anything else. And I think the case sometimes can be made that those things are more political than anything else. And it was by one vote that Andrew Johnson was acquitted in the Senate and managed to remain in office to finish out his term. Bill Clinton and Donald Trump are the only other 2 presidents to have been impeached, and Donald Trump, of course, was impeached twice. The second time he was actually out of office, and that's a whole nother discussion for another time. Now, one other power that the Senate has is to elect the vice president if there is no candidate that gets a majority of the votes in the Electoral College. Remember, the House gets to elect the president, The Senate elects the vice president if there's no majority in the Electoral College, and the rules here are different. In the House, it's by delegation. In the Senate, if no vice presidential candidate receives a majority of the electoral votes, the Senate votes to choose the vice president from the top two candidates for vice president. And so a simple majority of the entire Senate is all that's needed, and each senator gets one vote. So in that case, here again, theoretically, you could have a president of one party and a vice president of another party. And there's typically more than one candidate, or rather more than two candidates on the ballot. Illinois had 3 candidates on the ballot in the last presidential election. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was still on the ballot even though he had officially withdrawn. And in other states, you could have maybe 3 or 4 or more candidates on the ballot. But the Senate would only take the top 2, which in modern times would be the Republican and the Democrat. That would get really interesting if Donald Trump was elected by the House and, say, Tim Walsh was elected by the Senate to be vice president. Interesting, isn't it? Now, what if no party gets a majority in the Senate? There's always an even number of senators, so it's possible that the Senate could be split evenly, and that has in fact happened. In 1881, Democrats and Republicans had 37 seats each, and then there were 2 independents, one caucusing with each party. In 1954, the Republican caucuses and Democrat caucuses were split, 48-48 for part of the year. There weren't 100 senators at that time. Hawaii and Alaska hadn't been admitted to the Union yet. So there were only 96 senators all total. In 2001, as a result of that debacle of an election between George W. Bush and Al Gore, there was a 50-50 split in the Senate in January of 2001. And that went on for about 5 months. And then in 2021, after the Democrats swept 2 runoff elections in Georgia, the Senate was again split 50-50. So what do? Well, there's an answer to that. It's found in the U.S. Constitution, actually. Article 1, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution states that the Vice President of the United States shall be President of the Senate, but shall have no vote unless they be equally divided. So when you have a 50-50 split, and each party presents their candidate for majority leader, the Vice President's going to go with whatever party he, or I guess she, is a member of. So Kamala Harris got to cast the tie-breaking vote for majority leader, which gave the majority to the Democrats. And until the midterm elections, the Democrats were considered the majority party. Now, together, both houses of Congress can do certain things, and in some cases must do certain things. For instance, to declare war, you need a vote of both houses. And despite all the military intervention the United States has been involved in, Congress has only declared war 5 times. After we won our independence, we had another little skirmish over there with our former colonizers in 1812. And then in 1842, the United States declared war on Mexico. In 1898, declared war on Spain. In 1917, we entered World War I with a formal declaration. And then, of course, the day of infamy, December 7th. On December 8th, Congress declared war on Japan. Both houses must approve one final version of any given bill before it goes to the president. A lot of times you get the House passes a version of a bill, the Senate passes a version. You can't send 2 versions of the same thing to the president, so they'll appoint a conference committee to work out the differences, and then it goes to the president for a signature or a veto. And speaking of vetoes, if the president vetoes a bill, then 2/3 of both houses are needed to override that veto. And if 67 senators and then 2/3 of whatever 435 is vote to override the veto, the bill becomes law. So now back to the last part of Julie's question. Do the midterms have an effect on actual government? An unqualified yes. They will have an effect on government. Since the end of World War II, the midterm elections are not kind to the president's party. Since the end of World War II, the president's party has lost an average of 25 to 27 seats in the House of Representatives and 4 seats in the Senate. Now, sometimes they can lose large numbers of seats and it won't matter. Lyndon Johnson was elected in a huge landslide. In fact, it was the largest to that point in 1964. Had huge majorities in both houses of Congress. 1966, his popularity was declining, and the Democrats lost over 40 seats in the House of Representatives, but they still retained control of that. In fact, they retained control of both houses of Congress. They had quite a bit of wiggle. But if historical averages hold in the 2026 midterms, the U.S. Senate right now, with only 51 seats needed for a majority, the Republicans have 53 seats. And if the historic average holds true, they will lose 4 seats, which means they'll be down to 49 seats, and they'll be out of power. Now, when you look at the actual map and how things are laid out right now, they've actually got a fairly good chance at holding on to the Senate if the election were held now. But the election is still a year away, and that's an eternity in politics. Anything can happen. Meanwhile, on the House side, Democrat chances are actually much better. They need only 218 seats for a majority. The Republicans only have 220 seats. A loss of more than 2 seats, and they're out of power. Now, that could theoretically happen during 2026 if 2 Republicans happen to vacate their seats and the Democrats are able to flip those seats. If a Republican, let's say, dies or accepts an appointment from the president to another office, or just decides to resign, he gets convicted of a felony or indicted, any number of things could happen. Because the average historic loss in the House since World War II is 25 seats. So the Republicans could quite possibly take a shellacking in the House of Representatives. Stay tuned for further developments. And here's where it can really get interesting, because the rules of procedure and how legislation is handled are different. In the House, debate is limited. With 435 members, you can't have everybody speaking at once. And so I think it's an hour for each side of the legislation. And then they'll decide how to divvy up the time, who gets to speak, and for how long. And then a simple majority is all that's needed to pass legislation. You got 218 votes, your bill passes. In the Senate, the rules of procedure are different. It takes more than a simple majority for some legislation and for some appointments to pass. Debate is typically unlimited. You could go on for days. I'll come back to that in just a minute. Because in the Senate, they have what's known as the filibuster. And when I was in high school, a textbook defined the filibuster as talking a bill to death. That means basically you're delaying or you're trying to block legislation, and once you have the floor, if debate has not been limited, you can stand up there for days if you want. But in 1917, a rule was passed in the Senate that said you need a 2/3 vote to invoke cloture. Cloture simply ends the debate on a bill. It does not pass it. So we can invoke cloture, and then we can take a vote on the bill, and you may have 100-0 in favor of cloture, but then the bill goes down 100-0 because, well, people just get tired of talking about it and want to move on. In 1975, that number was reduced to 3/5, which would, in today's Senate, require 60 votes to invoke cloture. And as I said, you could talk for literally days. In 1957, Strom Thurmond, at that time a Democrat, he's the only major Democrat to switch parties and become a Republican. He was a senator from South Carolina, and once he got the floor, he spoke for 24 hours and 18 minutes against a civil rights bill. That is today still the longest filibuster. Now, Cory Booker took the floor. He's a current Democrat from New Jersey. He took the floor for 25 hours and 5 minutes, but that wasn't a filibuster. He was making a speech about something else. I don't even know what it was, but he has the record for longest speech. But for a specific filibuster, it's still held by Strom Thurmond. If the president's party loses majorities in both houses, number one, his legislative agenda is in danger. When presidents and governors get elected, they make all kinds of promises. People forget that when the president gets to Washington, he's got to work with both houses of Congress. And if one or both of those houses are controlled by the opposite party, he will have some issues getting his agenda through. And then it's got to go through the courts. Just about any bill that gets passed, I can almost guarantee somebody somewhere is going to challenge it in court. And all of that can gum up the works, and his agenda may or may not get through. Appointments can become more difficult to confirm in the Senate if the president's party loses control. When Barack Obama's judicial appointments were getting jammed up, even though the Democrats had a majority, they needed more than 51 votes to confirm judicial appointments. The rules got changed by Harry Reid, who was the majority leader from Nevada at the time. And then the Republicans again changed rules for Supreme Court justices, and all of that led to a 3-0 run by Trump when he came to Supreme Court appointments. So be very, 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 very careful when you start tampering with the rules. The only reason the filibuster is still there is because you had two Democrats who refused to go along with abolishing it back when Kamala Harris had that 50-50 split. And then now Trump is wanting to get rid of the filibuster. So my advice, Mr. President, leave the filibuster alone because eventually the shoe will be on the other foot and the Republicans will regret getting rid of it if they do. And then in the case of Donald Trump, impeachment becomes a real possibility. All it takes is a simple majority of the House of Representatives to impeach somebody, 218 votes. And then once impeachment gets over to the Senate for trial, you need 2/3 or 67 senators to vote for conviction. If the Democrats get control of the House in the 2026 midterms, I think impeachment of Donald Trump for a third time is a very real possibility. I think actually, I'll guarantee it will happen. But in the Senate, unless something happens that it's just a complete blowout for the Republicans, and the Democrats pick up about 20 more seats, conviction won't happen. He'll be able to finish his term. Questions, comments? Leave them in the comment section below. I'll be glad to answer them and try to help people to understand, especially Americans, to understand exactly how our government works. Thanks for watching. Leave your comments in the comment section below. Have a great day. Have a blessed day. Be good to yourself, and if you possibly can, be good to somebody else. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.